Welcome to Read and Think. This is where a book that I'm reading, certain phrases catch my eye and make me think, and I'm sharing with you. First up, Thomas Sowell in his Cultures and Conquests book. The degree to which England was altered by the invasion of Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and others, and by the later Norman invasions, may be indicated by the fact that the present-day English language contains very few words from the language of the Britons in pre-Roman times, though it contains many words of Latin, Germanic, and French origin. The Norman invasion and conquest of England in 1066 marked the last of the great cultural and racial additions to British society from continental Europe. A people of Norse origins, the Normans had become culturally French after their conquest in France during the century and a half preceding their invasion of England. Concurrently, individual bands of Normans launched campaigns of conquest in southern Italy and Sicily, and still later, Normans would also be involved as individuals in the Spanish reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from its Islamic rulers. In addition to being renowned warriors, the Normans were also effective as rulers, creating a reign of law and order under which economic development flourished in Normandy. They were also active in building and patronizing churches and schools, both of which were outstanding by the standards of the times. That the Normans came from France was not incidental, for France was in the forefront of European civilization while England still lagged behind. It's very telling that Richard Lionheart, probably amongst the most famous of English kings, he spoke French. He was actually a duke in France, and he spoke French mostly, almost no English, I believe, yet he was among the most famous British monarchs. So there was a period of time there where the French language was the court language before English had its amalgamation together and was used under the Canterbury Tales, as we will see later. What's interesting to note is that the Swedish monarch, after Napoleon's rage through Europe, was the House of Bernadotte, a French marshal of France who worked and served under Napoleon, became the King of Sweden, and so French became the court language of Sweden for an extended period of time. And here we have the Normans, who were French. They were originally Vikings. That's where you get the word Norman, Northman, Norman. And so Normandy itself had a very big trading commerce component of its society and its focus. And they brought that to England. So the rule of law mattered in how you dealt trade and how you flourished in terms of commerce. And then the language itself, of course, with French input there, allowed it to actually have some degree of accommodation on the continent where further trade could happen. So I think it's very fascinating to see that this final invasion of the Normans, on some small note, my family, the Mandevilles, came from Normandy, France, and theoretically, the first, second, and third Earl of Essex was a Mandeville. I'm not saying we're related, I haven't done that research, but the idea that the Mandevilles went from there to England, to Ireland, where many of my ancestors for a few hundred years came, is an interesting migration there into England and then Ireland for me. There is a village in Normandy called Mandeville, and so I've gone there, and it's funny to go and check it out. But indeed, that influence into England was massive, and I think that it has a lasting legacy here, both in language, commerce, and the rule of law. Three things that will come about in England's fruition into the industrial age. The Norman conquest meant not simply the replacement of one king with another, but a widespread takeover of land and power by Normans, a cultural revolution among the upper classes of the country, a strengthening of the power of the monarchy, an architectural revolution, and an infusion of new racial strains into an already mixed population. In the wake of the Norman conquest came the French language and culture, which became dominant in the political and elite social life of England. Parliamentary proceedings and the law were in French, as was social discourse among the aristocracy, while Latin the language of religious and scholarly work. The English language and culture remained largely that of the masses and the lesser gentry. King Edward III, whose reign began more than 2.5 centuries after the Norman conquest, was perhaps the first king of England who spoke more than a few words of the English language. The Normans were noted for their adaptability, one of the secrets of their success, but over the centuries they were said to adapt themselves out of existence. So what is fascinating here is that the Normans, a far superior culture in terms of architecture, ruling, the rule of law and governance, and other elements, including and especially the French language that they brought to England, dominated that country and changed it completely for its entire future. But its language itself and the culture of French eventually was drowned out by the use of English, and certainly we will see that later on. But at the same time, there was a big division here between the ruling Normans and the higher aristocracy in speaking French, and separating the people, the common people, from the aristocracy by the use of language. I think it's fascinating that the Normans indeed adapted themselves out of existence by not maintaining their cultural supremacy here in terms of England, and that eventually the use of the language, possibly through commerce and other dealings, having to deal with the common people in one way or the other, forced the language to come more into vogue in terms of law, in terms of common exchanges, transactions, and everyday occurrences. If the common people were merchants and just simply couldn't understand the language, the aristocracy or their representatives were forced to speak that language and adapt to it. So that is probably what happened there, but it's a fascinating look at the result of language and conquerors in relation to another country, and to see how that happens over and over again with this adaptability and then eradication of the primary culture in relation to the more common one.